Want to listen to this Ivory Tower Boiler Room episode and all of our Ivory Tower Boiler Room episodes ad free? Head to our Patreon, patreon.com. That's patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room for $5 a month. You get all of our ad free episodes, our video interviews, and our bonus episodes. See you there. Poem was Whitman's word for a man's cock. This poem, drooping shy and unseen, that I always carry and that all men carry, which comes from Spontaneous Me, because I've just added it into my dissertation. Uh, but John wondered how Whitman described to himself the tremor in a man's buttocks as he stepped down towards water, their heart-seizing paleness. Again, water, like the myth of Narcissus. Like, what is it about the 28 bathers? What is it about water? For some reason, I do find that there is such an erotic impulse between men with water. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I can now say I'm Dr. Andrew Rimby, which I was thinking of changing my name on the video, but no, I'm not going to do that. So I'm so excited because I actually am joined with a fellow doctor in humanities, a doctor in 19th century British history. So, history, literature, some intersections, definitely, even though I've stepped into the murky water before if I try to claim that I'm doing history. So I always make it clear I'm a literary scholar, just because some are very adamant about that. And maybe I'll get into that with my guest, um, because I'm joined with Tom Crewe, who was born in Middlesbrough in 1989. I love that in his bio, it actually has the year he's born. So I guess I'll say I was born in 1992. Um, and since 2015, he's been an editor at the London Review of Books. He's contributed more than 30 essays on politics, art, history, and fiction. And I can't believe it, but The New Life is actually his first novel. And it feels like he's in the stratosphere of E.M. Forster and so many queer male writers that I've turned to from the Victorian into the modernist period. So I think, your book fits very well on the shelves of
That's very
icons, Tom.
that's very nice to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm so happy that I contacted you, that I was able to figure out how to contact you since, you do have a Twitter account, which everyone can follow. It's in our show notes. But you're not necessarily as visible on social media as, say, I am with my thirst for queer social media content. Um, but I'm just curious, how did this, first of all, The New Life, it's a historical fictional novel. And I always think when you say a historical novel, does it always imply fiction?
Well, the word novel, I suppose, implies fiction, unless you're going to go down the Truman Capote, Norman Mailer route. Um, so yes, I would say, but I actually don't really like the term historical novel or historical fiction. I would rather be seen as just writing fiction and a novel rather than being immediately put into a category which might put people off or I don't know, or it just seems to suggest that I'm making a particular kind of effort, which I don't think I am. Um,
Mm.
that's by the
Well,
by.
and it's so fascinating because the reason I ask that is Tom knows I've used The New Life now in my dissertation and actually comes when I introduce John Addington Symonds. So John Addington Symonds is our main squeeze here in The New Life. Uh, he is fictionalized, but I'll call you a fiction writer. Tom Crewe, the fiction writer. Um,
Yes.
but John Addington Symonds is a Victorian sexologist. And I thought it was just so interesting how timely your novel is because, like, my thirst for John Addington Symonds really came from Whitman's 2019 200th birthday. And like in 2019, I had done a Whitman and Oscar Wilde talk at Brooklyn Public Library. Now I have a Whitman and queer theory article that begins with John Addington Symonds. And like, what was it for you that sparked your interest? Like, how did you even know who John Addington Symonds was?
Well, I didn't to begin with, and what happened was it was 10 years ago, and I think you're right that Simmons's profile has grown in the last decade. It does feel like he's having more of a moment, and there's this new book, the first kind of full-scale book about him by an academic called Shane Butler, which is the first since the early 60s. When with Phyllis Grosskurth's biography came out in the early 60s. And so we've got this big new book. We've got all of this kind of new queer study stuff is bringing him in. But 10 years ago, when I came across his name, I was reading a biography of Oscar Wilde, Richard Ellman's biography of Oscar Wilde, just out of interest. And it's so long ago that I can't quite place the moment, but I think I must have come across, he must have been mentioned in the text or mentioned in a footnote, and it clearly, there was something, and I've never gone back to check, but there was clearly something there that caught my attention about this other gay man at the end of the 19th century in Britain. And I remember that very quickly I ordered Grosskurth's biography, got a secondhand copy, and read it super fast, read it in 2 days flat or something, and was just completely gripped by this character. And really it was the sense of, why did I not know about this man before? Why did I not know about this other gay figure who, unlike Wilde, was so articulate about what it meant to be a gay man living at that time?
Well, and shout out to Shane Butler, actually, because he was on a conference I cre created last year for the Queer History Conference in San Francisco. So I know Shane and his work. And it actually was all about classical Victorian homoeroticism. Like, or actually, I think it was, yes. And a lot of the focus was on ancient Greece and how it's used, because that's what my work is on. I'm really interested in, look, why is ancient Greece this foundation? And for the longest time, Whitman scholars hadn't looked at ancient Greece because they took Whitman at his word. Um, that he didn't have a direct allusions to literature, which is so untrue. And like I explore, like there is a lot of Greek mythology in his work that you just have to look under the surface. Like I remember Symonds talks about in his first letter in 1871 to Whitman that there's an echo and a faint of ancient Greece. And like the word echo already implies the myth of Narcissus. And I find it so interesting. Symonds keeps this like seed planted of, okay, I'm going to figure out the queerness in Whitman's work. Like I want him to have this speech act. I want him to have this declarative statement, which, Whitman, unlike so many, they think that John Addington Symonds and Whitman were at tension, which is not true at all. Like, there's like the one letter at the end of Whitman's life. But other than that, they have at least a 10-year friendship. Like, this is a long uh, pen pal type relationship or fandom, right? I mean, Symonds is sending a Love and Death, his poem to Whitman. He's inspired so much that he actually sets it in ancient Greece. And I mean, Tom, what was it like for you to actually, because I know you had to read through, you have a whole acknowledgement section, which I so appreciate at the end of the Symonds biographies, of his letters, of the archives that you rely on. Like,
Mm.
what did you discover in this process of the archive? Hi, I'm interrupting what I know is a riveting discussion because I have to talk to you all about one of our sponsors, Broadview Press. Broadview Press is an independent academic publisher for all of your humanities related book needs. Make sure first that you use an exclusive code they're only giving to us for Ivory Tower Boiler Room listeners. The code is Ivory Tower, and you get 20% off your broadviewpress.com order. So, some of the books you can get, actually, we've had the writers on our very own Ivory Tower Boiler Room podcast. Have you all heard our sound writing episode with doctors Kyle Stedman and Tanya Rodriguez? So, sound writing, they discuss first, what does that term mean? How do you use digital media projects in the college classroom? Also, how do we interpret and analyze podcast episodes like our very own Ivory Tower Boiler Room? And we break down all of the different podcast genres and just how we're using media in our own lives. And especially if you're teaching media. And we even bring up artificial intelligence, which I know is a hot button issue right now. Also, make sure you listen to Dr. Jeffrey Weinstock, who talks about being a mad scientist of sorts as a composition scholar. And he talks about what it means to do pop culture research and teaching in the college classroom. Then in the fall, we had Dr. Ann Stevens on to break down what it means to be a literary theorist. And we even play a really fun literary criticism game where Anne uses all of these different theories to approach the Wizard of Oz film. So it's such an enjoyable episode. We love having the Broadview Press sponsor our podcast. And again, use that code Ivory Tower for 20% off all of your Broadview Press texts. I can't wait to feature a really exciting episode with Broadview Press about the philosophy of sport. So that, stay tuned, is coming up in our summer season.
Well, I mean, certainly what one thing the novelist has to do that the historian or the scholar does not is they have to at some point leave the research behind, leave the facts behind, or alchemize the facts into something else, into a fiction, into a drama. So to some extent, it was about immersing myself in Symonds, in Havelock Ellis, who is the basis of my other main character, in this kind of world of Victorian sexology and theories about what homosexuality was, what it meant, why it existed. It was about sort of delving into all that, but then also having the confidence and the courage to leave it behind, knowing enough that I could almost forget about it, and just try and tell my story. So that's the kind of broad picture. I just and I don't want to pose as an expert. I'm not you. I'm sure you have much more expertise than I do. I'm very much an amateur. I have a PhD in 19th century history, but it's nothing to do with any of this. And so I was reading through the obvious sources, the books I could find, the articles, and it was just this case of trying to immerse myself in a different order of being, different way of thinking, to get to the point where it would seem instinctive to me what a kind of Symonds person might think about this or that, how he might perceive the world. So a big thing for Symonds was knowing the way Symonds appreciated art and Renaissance arts, statuary, a lot of the time focusing on the male body, the representation of the male body, the way he perceived that, and also knowing his poetry, the way he describes and discusses and centers the male body. It was then obvious that my John character, who is adapted from Symonds, is not in any way a direct representation of Symonds, but is a Symonds kind of character, that he would perceive the world in these kind of sexualized, aestheticized ways, that he would respond to the male body as he perceived it day to day on the street, at the river, watching the swimmers at the Serpentine. Mm-hmm. So in my book, his kind of whole gaze is filtered through sexuality and physical response and aesthetical appreciation.
Well, and I don't want you to sell yourself short. I mean, Tom, what's amazing to me is your work is so groundbreaking because it's the type of work that we really need right now in arts and culture, which is, in my opinion, the fictive academic, like the fictive genre of something so inspired by the archive, and that there's these creative leaps you take in your spacing, adaptation. I know you have to be careful when you say this because you don't want it to come across as historical record. Um, and I think though, what's so exciting is the new life could play on a stage. I could see that. It can play in a film. I could see that definitely. And I'm sure there's discussions happening as all, you know, novels that get a lot of buzz. There's the rights being acquired, and I know how hard it is for
Mm,
it to make that next stage. But what's so exciting to me, Tom, is you've shown academics like myself, like you even being on this podcast and show is what we need for the public to see is okay, well, this is what's behind the scenes of so much attention to the archive, or, because there's so much um, gatekeeping, not intentionally, but just accessing scholarly research that's published because of paywalls and they only get shared among a certain coterie. And I think a lot of that is changing, definitely. And your work is doing that, like saying to academics, okay, well, let's now look into the archive. You know,
mm,
where
mm.
did Tom get his inspiration? That I definitely am going to teach your novel when I have the chance to do another 19th century queer centered course, because you really look into eroticism in a way that to me shows Symonds, like Wilde's, Victorian expert, I mean, not Victorian, sorry, ancient Greek and classics expertise. Like they're not Whitman. I mean, Whitman is so, like what I find is he's so at tension with education. Like he's reading translations of Homer, like that the everyday person would if they're interested in the classics, which already I think is, you know, symptomatic of Whitman being an autodidact in a way, but he's not a scholar. Like Whitman does not know Greek, unlike Symonds, unlike Wilde. So, like, how did you find this tension between this transatlantic tension? Because there's the British type of queer aesthetic, and then there's this American aesthetic.
Well, I suppose what's anyway, I'm glad you've said all that. And I was speaking at an event last night, and I said something similar, that I sort of don't want to claim, or I don't really believe that my book is an attempt to, or it's certainly not a self-conscious attempt to give voice to people whose voices were lost or repressed, partly because someone like Symonds did an awful lot of talking and writing about himself, and gives his own wonderful record of his life. So I don't see myself as having that kind of restorative, almost political purpose. I really was just trying to write a good novel. But one of the things I wanted to do, and I hope that the novel does do, is redirect people's attention to the past, to all the historical work that's been done and that can be accessed, and that will be a wonderful effect of the novel. If the novel both entertains and gives pleasure as a novel, but also might encourage some people to think, oh well, I'd love to know a bit more about the kind of the real life stuff behind this, then that's a complete victory. That's a triumph. But going on to your second point, I think one of the interesting things is actually how, and one of the things I hope I sort of bring out in the novel, is how actually someone like Symonds or Wilde are aesthetes. They are intellectuals. They are very refined characters, but they are simultaneously drawn to this ideal of the natural, the Greek, and the Greek and the natural are sort of equated. I mean, this is why people called Whitman's poetry Greek, said it evoked a Greek spirit, because it was so bodily, because it was kind of stripping out all this kind of Christian rhetoric and morality that had been constructed around physicality, and sort of restoring this very Greek sense of being at balance with your human body and appreciating the human body as an object. This idea that if you have a healthy body, you have a healthy mind, you have a
Yes,
healthy
yes.
body equals a healthy culture. And so what's actually interesting is that there is always this pull that the aesthetes intellectuals are actually being pulled always towards something much more unintellectual, towards the body, towards nature, towards the body in nature. That it's actually about leaving all that behind, which of course explains and underpins the way some of these men are so drawn to working class men. They see these working class men as more natural, as more bodily, as more at home in themselves, and that they are because they're lacking culture, because they lack all this constructed morality and all this anxiety, that they are kind of more truly human. And of
Mhm.
course, that is a an interesting attitude, and it can be very progressive. This kind of Whitmanite democratic ideal that it's enabling cross-class relationships, and it's about comradeship, and that's wonderful. But of course, there is also something dubious about this. It's patronizing. It's clearly sexually charged. It's clearly not just about idealism and Whitmanite thinking. It really is, sexual and actually getting off on the class distinction, not you know, submerging the distinction, but actually, in a way, fetishizing the distinction
Mhm.
and getting off on that. So I think that's all going on. It's those things are actually in constant dialogue. The intellectual and the unintellectual, and it actually underpins in a way the entire of my book and this whole historical moment, I think.
And no, thank you for that. I mean, it's all quite subversive in my analysis. Like my take is Whitman and Wilde share something, even though their education is at odds. Um, right? Wilde um writes the picture of Dorian Gray after he's seen Whitman twice in Camden. And something that I find in Wilde adaptations, right? There are a lot more, not a lot, but there's a lot more Wilde fictional accounts. I've seen a play um, with Rupert Everett, and but they're always interested in the trial. I still am waiting for a fictional account of Wilde in his like Greek youth, his Greek days when he was that college student, when he was just eager. And I think it would be very different without the Bosie connection.
Yeah.
And the picture of Dorian Gray I find fascinating because it's so subversive. I know you don't deal with the picture of Dorian Gray, but or as it's not the Symonds connection, but ancient Greek mythology makes such an appearance. Um, Dorian is called Narcissus a lot of times. And in my opinion, it's actually pederastia gone wrong. Like, this is not, it's the ancient Greek system turned askew. Like, what happens is Dorian is not supposed to succumb to his beauty. He's not supposed to become Narcissus. He's supposed to just submit, and he doesn't submit. But that's my own take of what happens. But where Whitman actually presents the idyllic vision of comradeship, like you said, he presents, in a way, pederastia gone right. And there's a
Hmm.
lot of
Hmm.
issues with it, with consent, with age, but it's all there. Like you've said, the working class fetishism, there's a racialized fetishism with Whitman, especially. He's very interested in white bodies, white bellies bulging, and black bodies are seen in a very primal sexual urge type of way.
Hmm.
And, and I think it's so important that you bring that up, Tom, that there's this subversive or even there's problematics with these visions. And I mean, Symonds himself distinguishes in sexual inversion that, Symonds, he is the proper homosexual.
Mm.
He is not like the effeminate or this other group of the working class. And I've always found that ripe for discussion. Like, and
Mm.
why do you think it's so important to address? Like you said, you're not holding Symonds up as the martyr. Like, this is not, like, even with me with Whitman, this is not, okay, we're now going to embody their ethics of homoeroticism.
Mm. Well, Why does it feel important? I suppose just because
LGBT stories are universal, but each one speaks to the individual heart and soul of the writer telling it. Do you have a story to tell? Or have you been moved recently by an LGBT book, film, painting, television show, or other form of media? Then the Gay and Lesbian Review wants to hear from you. The GNLR believes in bringing awareness to queer art and artists through reviews, commentary, and thought pieces in which the author relates their personal lives to a particular piece of art, a novel, a movie, or what have you. In addition to the print magazine, the GNLR also publishes articles on its blog as well as personal essays on its popular Here's My Story section on glreview.org. That's glreview.org. To learn more about submitting an article for the GNLR, visit their writer's guidelines. The link is located at the bottom of the homepage. And if you have any questions, email publisher Stephen Hemrick. That's STEPHEN.HEMRICK at glreview.org. The GNLR and its readers can't wait to see what you have to say. Do you know that when I'm not delivering an epic Ivory Tower Boiler Room episode to you all, that I do actually go on to other podcasts and other interview shows? Well, one show that I really have to tell you all about is called That Old Gay Classic Cinema. I know so many of you here love classic films. You love queer concepts and analyses. So, let me just give you a few of the episodes that are on That Old Gay Classic Cinema. First, you have to listen to the first ever episode they did, where I got to talk about being Captain Von Trapp in The Sound of Music. So, yes, it's an epic Sound of Music episode. There's a Gone with the Wind episode, The Wizard of Oz, Cinderella, 101 Dalmatians, Sleeping Beauty, and most recently, I and Married to Pippi from True Crime and Academia, we were invited onto the Alfred Hitchcock Vertigo episode. So make sure you follow That Old Gay Classic Cinema on Instagram and on TikTok. Christian Garcia, the host. I know that he would really love if you listen to his podcast, follow it on Apple and Spotify. Make sure that you rate and review it. And I think I'll definitely be back on That Old Gay Classic Cinema, so I'll keep you all updated. But after you finish listening to this current Ivory Tower Boiler Room episode, get your ears on That Old Gay Classic Cinema. Enjoy, you all.
again, a novelist is always looking for complexity, as a historian is, as a literary scholar is. You would be a bad version of each of those things if you try to take the most simple reading. It's instinctive to try and search for nuance and search for the sharp edges. So in a way, it would have been sort of cowardly and morally stupid to avoid those issues, and yet in a way, I thought that was sort of what was happening, in the sense that the big thing that really got me thinking about the novel was discovering Symonds, discovering what Symonds represented, what he was trying to do, trying to actually write these books, try and get reform, change the law, change social attitudes. And I was sort of stunned that this is the man we've forgotten, or that's how it felt to me at the time. This is the man who has no standing or status in popular culture. And yet we idolize Wilde, and all gay men are told to, or feel that Wilde is their, brother, uncle, grandfather. We feel like he is the line we draw on. We are in the line of the martyr, not in the line of Symonds, who was doing something different. And I thought, actually, what happened to Wilde was very largely self-inflicted, leaving out the kind of big structural issues. And I suddenly saw that he had brought this disaster on himself, and it had had all these terrible side effects, and kind of, you know, blown the sort of Symonds, Edward Carpenter, Ellis
Hmm.
project out of the water, and that this moment, the 1890s, had actually been a period of great optimism, not a period of great darkness that is what we now think. So I was I was frustrated by the kind of simplicity of the story we were being told, and the simplicity of the way Wilde's story was being told. Um, so I wanted to show both. I had a kind of cheeky, perverse urge to sort of cast Wilde as the villain. And, what does this story look like if we push Wilde out of the center of the story and we tell a story about gay people in the 1890s in which Wilde does not feature directly, but also if everyone's relationship to Wilde is generally negative, what will that do? And so that was important, but it was also then equally important to complexify the picture for the Symonds Carpenter style people. It wasn't enough to then suddenly say, and here are the good guys, because clearly they were not completely innocent either. And I was very aware also of the kind of very simplistic um, idolization of E.M. Forster's Morris, which
Yes.
again seemed to be just celebrated as a kind of queer classic, and um, again as a sort of inheritance that all gay people should be, grateful for. And I thought, well, actually, Morris is a real expression of the kind of Symonds Carpenter ideology, Whitman ideology. It's a simplistic expression of that, where Morris runs off with a gardener, and most things are happy ever after, and we don't find out what it would have been like for those two men to try and have a relationship. We don't see the dark side of the picture. So another thing I immediately wanted to do in the novel was sort of, I remember even writing this in when I made the proposal to my agent, I kind of reverse Morris, the kind of dark side of Morris, try and show that moment with more complexity and difficulty. So
Hmm.
all in all, that became the project of the whole book, to try and create a very complicated, nuanced look at this moment in history, this society, and not to make easy heroes, not to have saints, to just try and show in all sorts of ways how a homophobic culture warps everyone in different and strange ways.
Yeah. Well, have you read William DeCanzio's Alec and Beth Ann Roberts' My Policeman?
No, I have not.
Oh, okay. Well, I've had them both on. Beth Ann Roberts, My Policeman is a take on E.M. Forster and his relationship with the policeman.
Yeah,
And then uh Alec is this like the backstory behind who Alex Scudder is and taking away the privileging of Morris. So definitely very interesting
yeah,
novels. And but what's so interesting is you all really are like we're all in a way part of this overall discussion, which I think it's fair to say the inheritance of sexology, the Victorian sexology specifically, right? I mean, from all of the reading you did with Symonds and Ellis and Carpenter, it takes a while for the public to know what's happening behind the scenes. Like, it's not as if right away in the 1890s the public says, "Oh, that's what a homosexual is." Like, it
mm.
really doesn't take until World War II. Like Kinsey, I would say, really starts this public discussion. Like, why do you think there's this tension between, or not tension, but just a long time lapse between what's happening in this new emerging scientific field, right? And we could start with Kraft Ebing. Um, and Psychopathia Sexualis. But from that period up until, say, like the 1940s, like, why do you think this nomenclature, so to speak, of naming takes such a long time?
Well, I It's such a complicated subject, and again, I'm no true expert. I mean, my perception is that there are always words. There have always been words. I mean, you know, you might not have had homosexual, but you had sod or sodomite. You had Nancy, fairy, puff. You know, there were always words. There was always the sense that there were mollies. You know, there were people who behaved in a certain way, um, and that didn't necessarily crystallize into the same set of meanings that attach to the word homosexual. But um, I my, my sort of human instinct, which is in a way a kind of unintellectual instinct, is but also is a kind of commonsensical thing, is that you
Mhm.
know, these people existed. Most people knew that they existed. I mean, there's a book called, I'm looking as if it's on my, see if it's on my shelf. Is it called Unnatural Offences by, is he
Yes.
called H.G.
H.G.
Cox?
Cox. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
the wonderfully named. And uh, you know, he makes the point that actually, far from being unnamed, this offence was being constantly discussed in the papers. You know, they were, court cases were being reported fairly openly in the press, and so it was not that it was not present in people's lives. It was just that the language was being evaded, or that there was a different kind of language that existed. So the term homosexual may not have acquired any great popularity until the 40s, but I don't think that implies a lack of public consciousness. You know,
Mhm.
and that's, and I do think the Wilde trial and Wilde's downfall did give a kind of language, or a set of imagery for people to work with, and I think that was very influential. This idea of, though it was not by any means the only gay scandal around that time, but it did give the kind of set of tropes, you know, the age difference relationships, the working class, middle class relationships, the theatricality, the campness, the sense of a gay man dressing and talking differently, being performative. You know, I think a lot of that stuff, it has a long history, and there are precedents for that, but I think it did help give a particular image for what we would later call the homosexual. But you know, there's obviously the famous line from Morris. You know, I'm an unspeakable of the Oscar Wilde type, and you know, he doesn't need to say anything different. He can say Oscar Wilde, and people know what he means. He says the word
Mm.
unspeakable even as he is, in fact, speaking. So it's sort of like there is always a code there, I think, and obviously the people knew a lot. You know, people knew people. People knew people who knew people. Yeah, I just think it was a culture that was,
Mhm.
in a way, much more open and permeable than we might stereotypically think.
In my um analysis, like ancient Greek concepts with Symonds, Wilde, Carpenter, I mean, they're all turning to it. Whitman, even in its absentia, though he like declares it's not part of his poetics, it's all a circulating concept for the language that hasn't yet existed for what they're seeing as male desire. But is it unfair to say that Oscar Wilde is one of the best PR agents? Because in my opinion, the trial, The Love That Dare Not Speak is its name when he declares this, is a PR branding. I mean, like you've said, Wilde is used by Morris. Like Wilde is used as an evocation, as a not the person, but just as a concept. And like that to me says Wilde did a pretty damn good job of creating a branding. And I mean, he did that on his American lecture tour. Um, this is where I think Whitman and him get along. Whitman has been called one of the first influencers. And I think it's true because Whitman knew how to talk about his brand. And in my opinion, Symonds was really testing Whitman in the letters. Like Symonds was having Whitman declare that he is a homosexual, which Whitman has never agreed to, like never writes down. And even Symonds doesn't yet really, is it fair to say, hasn't really yet solidified what homosexual means at that point. So he's kind of like, okay, so Calamus. is this manly love, this athletic love, this warrior love. It's about men wanting to have sex with men, right? Like that's what he's trying to get to. And Whitman finally, I think, just realizes if he writes this down, he saved all his letters. The press is going to find out about it. It's going to
Mm.
hurt his legacy if he says yes. Because before that, he's had such a cordial conversation with Symonds. I mean, there's this love between them. So it seems like Whitman was trying to protect his brand in a
Mm.
way.
Mm. Mm. I
Is
mean,
how I read all of this.
yes, and Whitman was not, as is pointed out in my novel. I mean, Whitman was not shy about cracking on to some of these. Cracking on being a very English phrase, I'm sure. It was not shy. When Edward Carpenter visited him, Carpenter came back and said we went to bed together, and so he obviously thought there were things he could get away with in person that he couldn't on the page, which is very sensible of him. I mean, going back to Wilde, I think.
Hey, Ivory Tower Boiler Room listeners and true crime friends. You've heard me gush over this incredible woman and her beautiful products. I'm talking about Mandy Made It. Mandy makes customized and original crochet and pre-cut goods. They are the perfect, unique, one-of-a-kind gift for literally anyone in your life. And she makes incredible home decor. I still have my pumpkins that I put out every fall. I just love them. Check her out on Instagram at MANDEE Made It, or search Mandy Made It on Facebook. To order, just slide into her DMs, and if you mention the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, you will receive a free personalized gift with your first order. So, go on Instagram and look up at Mandy Made It, and Mandy is spelled MANDEE. Again, her handle is at Mandy Made It, Mandy spelled MANDEE, and order today.
Hi, this is Andrew, and I'm interrupting what I know is an exciting ITBR episode to talk to you about one of our sponsors, the Gay and Lesbian Review. Discover new things about gay and lesbian literature, history, and culture with a subscription to the Gay and Lesbian Review, a bi-monthly magazine of history, culture, and politics that publishes essays in a wide range of disciplines, as well as a slew of reviews of books, plays, and movies, and a number of special features, such as artist profiles and our popular art memo column. Each issue of the Gay and Lesbian Review brings you consistently intelligent, lively, thought-provoking articles focused on a unifying theme, and it brings together the leading minds on the topic. You won't find a lot about the latest dating fads or fashion trends, but you will definitely find articles about online dating, like using Grindr as a social phenomenon, or even the gay influence on 20th century fashion. Did you know that I've actually interviewed 3 Gay and Lesbian Review contributors? Make sure you listen to my Ignacio Darnad Breaking the Gay Code in Art episode, where Ignacio explains that key artistic figures like Michelangelo, Donatello, Thomas Eakins, J.C. Leyendecker, and Thomas Finland all have really explicit homoerotic artwork. And then head on over to the next episode where I talk with Dr. Vernon Rosario about LGBTQ psychiatry and how homosexuality got depathologized. And our most recent episode was with the Gay and Lesbian Review's literary editor, Martha E. Stone, and she talks about what LGBTQ literature you should be reading this summer, and also how to become a contributing writer and a reviewer for the Gay and Lesbian Review. To subscribe, visit glreview.org. That's GLREVIEW.org. Click subscribe and enter the promo code ITBR to receive a free copy with any print or digital subscription. And as an added bonus, you also receive online access to all of the Gay and Lesbian Review's archived issues. All of them. Okay, enjoy your reading, everyone.
what's interesting about Wilde, completely a shrewd and brilliant self-publicist, perhaps one of the best ever. But I don't know about the trial. He certainly created a set of images and a mythology. I mean, I forget. I've forgotten the name of his famous letter to Douglas from prison.
Yes. Oh, it's going to come to me. Oh my. I know.
Look,
I should know this.
Two experts.
But
anyway, but the whole way he kind of dresses up wonderfully the trial and the relationship and everything. But actually, I think the love that dare not speak its name was Bosey's phrase anyway. It's from one of Bosey's poems. And I think it's one of the things I was, again, quite kind of irritated by and provoked by. Wilde is actually not a good PR man for homosexuality in that trial case, really, because he refuses to admit that he's gay, denies it the whole way through, denies the relationships with these men, and it invokes these kinds of idealized David and Jonathan, Plato. He invokes that kind of desperately as a way of justifying these relationships he's been discovered as having, that they are not sexual, they are not gay, they are simply this, and that's it's a mode, it's a rhetoric, but it's not, to me, a very wonderful or positive defense of homosexuality. And I think you get that much more reading, Symonds's books about homosexuality have much more modern seeming, much more tangible, fresh declarations, common sense assertions about homosexuality that make a lot more sense now to us than anything that Wilde said, and should be much better known and celebrated, because he's the one that's really speaking the language of today, not Wilde.
Yes. Oh, you were talking about De Profundis.
De Profundis, yes, that's
right. Yes. I don't delve into Wilde's trial. That's for my second book. My first book is Whitman's Homoerotic Poetics, and then my second book is going to be, I'm going to manifest it, but it's going to be the Queer Victorian readers. So, we'll get to that. Yeah. No, my dissertation, it's called The Pool of Narcissus. So, Whitman's Homoerotic Poetics. But, I love everything you're saying, Tom, because I think, well, first of all, I've loved your work so much. But what I find is so interesting, right? And there's a moment I have to draw everyone's attention. Page 21. It's in part 1. It comes very early. You realize right away that Tom does not mince words around eroticism, and we're going to get a lot of phallic-centered language, and I absolutely love it. But here it says, right, Symonds is in a way analyzing Whitman's poetry, and this thought comes to him very Mrs. Dalloway-like. I did find a lot of that stream of consciousness was done really brilliantly. So bravo, Tom.
Thank
you. So it says, poem was Whitman's word for a man's cock. This poem, drooping shy and unseen, that I always carry and that all men carry, which comes from Spontaneous Me, because I've just added it into my dissertation. But John wondered how Whitman described to himself the tremor in a man's buttocks as he stepped down towards water, their heart-seizing paleness. Again, water, like the myth of Narcissus. Like, what is it about the 28 bathers? What is it about water? For some reason, I do find that there is such an erotic impulse between men with water. Like, what is it for you? Why do you think water is this, gets the cock to rise, or just causes this sensation? Is it the nudity aspect that's possible?
I think, do you know the wonderful anecdote that apparently Rupert Brooke, his party trick was to be able to jump into water and emerge with an immediate erection? So that's just a little nugget for you there. Well, I think it's almost certainly the fact that this is the only time when most men would bathe naked up until the 20th century, and it's the time when you would be exposed to male bodies in significant numbers. It was a kind of public display, and of course that therefore it would be very eroticized. That it's an opportunity, and it's so therefore water and the light and the air, the freshness, these places are often in kind of wooded or green enclosures. So I think there's just it wraps up, and again, as it does in my novel, of course for John it evokes Greece, it evokes the Greeks. It's this kind of idyllic scene, and I suppose there's also something Edenic about it. It is the time before shame. It's the nudity, as I say in the novel, something like nudity carelessly worn. It's pure simplicity. It's all of that stripped out, and the water is a kind of there's a cleansing aspect. There's a purifying associations. I think it can all work in that sort of magical way.
Yeah, well, and like I've talked a lot about, well, Jack Parlett and I are spirit animals. I don't know if you know Jack Parlett's work, but his book, The Poetics of Cruising and Fire Island, they are wonderful. Had him on a few times, and I always talk to him about how I love Fire Island and how empowered I felt being nude on the beach there. And I'll be back. I always go back. I live 25 minutes away, so I'm lucky.
Okay.
And but there is a community built of artists. Like, it's not sex. Like, I always have to explain that to the straight friends or community of mine, that it's not just about sex. It's like what you said. There's an aesthetic. There's right for Symonds. He even thinks Whitman's comradeship, it's not about the sex and the body only. It's about politics. It's about virtues, which is all Greek, right? That's basically what filial means. Like, in its root is this affection, the affection between men. It's the virtues. And that's what the gymnasium was, which means nude. That's what the symposium is supposed to be celebrating. But again, it's all very upper echelon men. And I think it's important that you really look into that in your work, because it's something to aspire to. And not everyone can reach the Fire Island destination because of cost, right? Like, there's barriers in this vision. There's the problematics of consent, right? It's not like the baggage doesn't follow. It's the ideal. That's why it's an ideal. It's out of reach.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
even for the ancient Greeks, it was out of reach. I mean, let's not kid ourselves.
Well, I think one of the things that maybe is different about the period I'm writing about is that in a way it was democratic, because these were this is a river it's called a river, but it's not really a river in the Serpentine near Hyde Park, but it's actually an artificial body of water. But it was available to all. It's a public space, and it's like the Hampstead bathing ponds in Hampstead in London still have a gay charge, because it's actually the fact that they are accessible that's also allows, in my novel, someone like John to kind of wander along and look like he's not looking, as though he's just sat in the park reading his book. So it's also these places where, like swimming pools, lidos, why do all these places have this kind of association? I think it's because they enable a kind of looking that might not be possible in other places, and it is a kind of accessible looking that you can maybe disguise. Maybe you're there just for a swim, but maybe you're not.
Oh, Tom Crewe is just beginning. Yes, this is the end of part 1, but guess what, everyone? I'm giving you all part 2 on Saturday, so you only have a few days to wait. So there's so much more to come about Victorian sexology, Tom's thoughts on why John Addington Symonds and Henry Havelock Ellis turned to Walt Whitman for an explanation of male-male same-sex desire. Why Whitman? Why his poetry? This is just the beginning. I can't wait for you all to hear part 2. And while you're waiting, why don't you listen to Mary's recent True Crime and Academia episode? Or look at our male homoerotic episodes on literature, art, TV. There's so much to listen to with the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. So thank you all for listening. And I can't wait for you all to hear the rest of what Tom has to say. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. This is Andrew Rimby, the host and director of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room podcast. I am joined with Mary DePippi, our chief contributor and host of True Crime in Academia. Please, if you're not, make sure that you follow the Ivory Tower Boiler Room and True Crime in Academia on Instagram and Twitter and TikTok too. Remember our TikTok. That's where all the exciting video clips are posted. Make sure that you join our Patreon if you want more Ivory Tower Boiler Room and True Crime in Academia content. All the video interviews are on our Patreon. All of our bonus episodes are on Patreon. And it just means so much for you to join for $5 a month. You unlock all of our bonus episodes. And also, it just helps support the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Thank you so much for giving Mary and I a needed jolt of caffeine for coffee. Thanks for the $5. Head to patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. We cannot wait for you all to listen to our summer season. There are so many exciting episodes. And we're also celebrating 3 years of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room podcast. So, without further ado, thanks for listening. Make sure you listen to the next episode next week. And have a wonderful summer season, everyone. Okay, bye now.